Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Here we are in November 2022, and we're still talking about redistricting in Ohio. I think we are always going to be talking about redistricting in Ohio. This is our agenda for the evening. We are lucky to have some wonderful people joining us. Freda Levenson from the ACLU is going to talk about the current court cases that are about Ohio maps that are currently going on. Trevor is going to take a look at some data on the election outcome using the rigged maps. Professor Niven is going to further give us some additional analysis of the impact of the gerrymandered maps and the election outcome. Dan Vicuna from Common Cause is going to talk about a national impact of gerrymandering and citizen commissions on the makeup of the U.S. House of Representatives. We're going to talk a little bit about what's next for Ohio maps. And then Catherine and others are going to just tell us a little bit about what it was like to be interviewed by Ira Glass for This American Life, which we will give you the link. Tiffany's going to be dropping links into the chat. And without further ado, I think Catherine was going to introduce Freda and maybe ask her some questions.
Well, Freda, we're so glad that you're able to join us. Now, Freda Levenson is the legal director for ACLU of Ohio. And as you know, the past year has all been about the lawsuits. And at some point, we know that, we voted on unconstitutional state legislative maps, and we know that we voted on unconstitutional congressional maps. I think the big question is really what is next, and how, tell us a little bit about where we are with the legal battle, if you can, Freda.
Sure, Catherine, thank you. Well, first, with respect to congressional redistricting, you know that in our Ohio Supreme Court challenges to the congressional map, we won them both. Ultimately, the Ohio court struck the second, which was the remedial map, the one we voted under, as being an unconstitutional gerrymander, and that was in mid-July this summer. And at that time, it gave the legislature 30 days, and then failing the legislature enacting a map, then the commission 30 days to come up with a new constitutional one. As you recall, they totally defied the Ohio Supreme Court order. Neither body took any steps at all. And instead, the Speaker of the House, Cupp, gave some press conference that said he thought that the state had the right first to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. They didn't consider the Ohio Supreme Court's word final on this. Now, the Supreme Court of the United States does not need to take a case like this. If the state wants the Supreme Court to take the case, they need to ask it to. They file what's called a petition for certiorari. And the state did file a petition with SCOTUS in September. And they're claiming that the Ohio Supreme Court orders were illegal under what's called the independent state legislature theory. I use the word theory lightly because it's not really a theory. It's a wacko notion, really. I believe Dan spoke with you about this at a meeting I was at.
Then we still need to raise the volume, but how can we make this small for a minute?
Freda, just for a second, I'm gonna ask folks to remember to mute themselves. Right now. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so go ahead, Freda.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, good. So I know that Dan gave you some pretty thorough background about the independent state legislature theory, but just for those of you who weren't there or to refresh your recollection of it, this really weird extreme notion says that because the Constitution grants state legislatures the authority to regulate the time, place, and manner of elections, that means that a state legislature's power to do so is completely unconstrained. No matter what a state constitution provides, no matter what the laws of the state say, whatever the legislature does to regulate elections is just untouchable by the law or by state courts. So a legislature could put whatever restrictions on voting or the conduct of elections that it wants to without constraint, and including the ability to gerrymander to its heart's content. regardless of what the Ohio Supreme Court said, regardless of the Constitution. Now, there's no basis in law or history for this crazy theory, but at least 4 of SCOTUS justices have expressed interest in recognizing and enforcing this theory in dicta in other cases. And Amy Coney Barrett, who has not yet given a clue about her feelings about this, given her ideology, she could well be the necessary 5th vote. So there's a chance that SCOTUS will buy this theory. We're going to be opposing the cert petition. We're working on it now. Our opposition is due on December 19th. So we will file an opposition to the cert petition in the U.S. Supreme Court. Meanwhile, we're going to get a clue as to what the court thinks about this theory. In the case of Moore versus Harper, which you may have heard about, it's a North Carolina gerrymandering case directly regarding the independent state legislature theory. That case is already queued up. It's well ahead of us in terms of the status. And it's already in the U.S. Supreme Court, and it is set to be argued on December 7th. So we'll be listening to that argument with interest. Now, if the Ohio cert petition is rejected by SCOTUS, then the Ohio Republicans have said that that's going to start their 60-day clock ticking away for them to draw a new map. So they will do it then, and we'll see what they do. If the Ohio case is accepted by SCOTUS, that's obviously going to radically change the timeline. It will take a while. SCOTUS could do a number of different things with the case, but if it says that it's going to take the case, it would be for next year, in 2023. And there's quite a timeline. We do need a new map for 2024 in time for the primary, because the current map, as I've said, is unconstitutional. It was stricken. So how these various deadlines and the necessity of having a new map play off against each other is something that we'll be looking very carefully at in the future. In terms of our litigation over Ohio's legislative plan, as you know, the original plan was enacted in September of 2021, over a year ago. And as Mia said, we've been doing this for a long time. Ultimately, there were 4 plans that were passed consecutively. Each time a plan was stricken, the state was sent back to the drawing board. They drew another plan, and each one was stricken. We've had 4 plans that were all unconstitutional. The last time the court ordered a plan was on June 3rd, but the commission thumbed its nose at the court. It didn't pass the map, didn't even meet. But then, of course, the Republican commissioners ended up getting to use their 3rd plan. That's the one we voted on. And they were enabled by the 3-judge panel, which I'm sure you recall, that ruled last April that it would order Plan 3, even though that plan was stricken by the Ohio Supreme Court. And ultimately, the same plan, when it was reenacted, was stricken again as Plan 4. So we don't have yet a plan either for the state legislative districts, because the Republican commissioners successfully ran out the clock. As with the congressional map, they've just made a mind-bogglingly outrageous display of disdain for our Supreme Court, the Constitution, the will of the vast majority of Ohioans. And the status is now that Map 3 was implemented for 2022, but only for 2022. And the Republican commissioners acknowledge that they will draw a new map. But now, of course, they're going to enjoy a court without Justice O'Connor and her pivotal swing vote. The new Chief Justice, Kennedy, has already voted in favor of retaining those gerrymandered maps, all of them, enacted by the commission last year. There's a vacancy left on the court, but it's going to be filled by Governor DeWine. So it's going to be a Republican who will vote along party lines whenever he or she gets the opportunity. So, the future of the litigation is, TBD. We'll see what's passed. We'll certainly analyze it. We'll think about our strategy and opportunities, and we'll be making some decisions.
So Freda, one of the things that has happened is the kinds of questions that I'm seeing really have to do with like the cognitive dissonance of the court kind of telling the redistricting commission what they were supposed to do and them ignoring it, and that sense of like, well, how do we get here? And just is there any other possible way? Basically, we have a number of kind of questions that are really about, should we sue them? And I'm like, well, that's exactly what you're describing. I guess, one of the things that I think might be helpful is, a little bit of information about like, why is it that like the clock ends up getting run out and that we just go ahead as opposed to rescheduling? If you could just give a framework for why they were able to run the clock out, I think that would be helpful.
Sure. Well, we had two forces operating against each other. One is the need to have an election, and courts do allow elections to take place even under unconstitutional conditions when there needs to be an election. Elections take place. This isn't the first time an election has taken place that's been imperfect. This one was far from perfect. There have been other far from perfect elections. We need to have an election. We can't hold up our democracy while we wait for litigation. So elections will happen. And the Republicans on the commission were able to continually evade coming up with a perfect map, because they knew this was going to be an iterative Groundhog Day process if they wanted it to be, because under the Constitution, the Ohio Supreme Court does not have the power to draw a new map itself. It can't appoint an independent map drawer to draw a map. Its role under the Constitution was to provide judicial oversight and to evaluate a map, to measure it against the Constitution to see if it passes muster, and to say, no, you need to go back to the drawing board if it doesn't. That's the extent of its power under the Constitution. And the court operated within the constraints of the Ohio Constitution.
Well, incredibly frustrating. I was just saying, Ellie just, describing, I think, what so many of us are feeling. We are grateful, to hear a little bit more. So one of the things that we'll do when we do the follow-up, we'll also include kind of additional information to read, including the Brennan Center for Justice put together some amicus. And Freda, do you have any final words before we say goodbye?
Yeah, I just want to say that all of this work hasn't been entirely futile. So just a few words of brightness. I know that Professor Niven's going to be talking to you in a bit to analyze the results of the election, but our litigation did have an impact on 2022. The exact extent won't be known until precinct data is available in several days, and experts can overlay the enacted maps and the maps that were used over this data and see how the results compare. But some things we do know already, and that was that for the congressional map, the original locked down 13 seats for the Republicans, leaving only 2 for the Democrats, which was way skewed. The remedial map, imperfect as it was, still ended up producing an 11-4 split. So not perfectly proportional, but certainly closer. So it was helpful to get some improvement. Also, we established important propositions of law, that the anti-gerrymandering provisions in the Constitution are real, they're mandatory, they're enforceable, and that's important. The question will be to see how well that law stands up now with a new court.
Well, thank you so much.
Yes. We appreciate that, and we will share this recording out, and we will continue to follow, everything that's happening with Moore v. Harper, et cetera, and there'll be more about that a little bit later in this presentation. Now I wanted to ask Trevor, who is going to be running the slides here, to go ahead and take over and talk to us about what happened with the maps that we used in this current election?
All right. Hi there. Thank you, Mia. And I put together some slides that I'm going to run through about some major takeaways and things that stood out to me. But I'm gonna bring in Professor Niven into this conversation, if he doesn't mind, just because he is the political scientist and I'm just a guy who looks at maps. But some of the things that stood out to me, first of all, was voter turnout was lower than 2018 midterms, depressed voters, distressed maps. I know Professor Niven wanted to speak on a little bit on that. We'll come back. In general, overall, I think the existing partisan preferences that existed already in the districts played out and kind of overperformed by a couple points. So Dem districts broke strong for Democrats and Republican districts broke heavy for Republican districts, Republican candidates. The big exception to that is incumbency. I think incumbency played a big role in this election. For example, the House map, has 16 toss-up districts, all of which lean Democratic. And of those 16, 9 of them had Republican incumbents. All of them won re-election. So you could see how, how strong incumbency plays in elections. What's your take on that, Professor Niven? I know he's here. I saw him.
Well, he may jump in later, but maybe keep going.
I know he wanted to talk, about how he believes some of the low voter turnout was due to, just distressed maps but okay, we'll go. So, first we'll look at the congressional map. And I want to make a couple clarifications really quick before we go on. The data that I use, these partisan lean data, I pull from Dave's redistricting, the most current Dave's redistricting. And so there may be a couple slight differences from what you may see put out from the SOS because they have Maptitude and it costs money to use Maptitude and I don't have that Maptitude. So this is from Dave's, the data that I could get available for free of charge. Democrats flipped congressional district 1. So there's that. Marcy Kaptur pretty much shined in Toledo. Amelia Sykes did well, and district, and those were the 3 toss-up districts, all leaning Dem. Dems won all those. District 10 was surprising to me. I thought that would have been a little bit closer. And District 10 was actually one of the districts that I approve. I really like that came out of that map. So that was surprising to me. And then another thing that was interesting that stood out to me was the District 7 and 13, which were the only 2 districts that didn't have incumbents, were the most similar to the partisan leaning of those districts. I think Amelia Sykes was boosted a little bit because I think of name recognition, but District 7, which I don't have on here, pretty much fell exactly within exactly how the partisan lean broke down. So I think, again, shows the strength of incumbency. And then here's, Cincinnati, District 1, keeping Cincinnati whole, picked up a seat for Democrats. And you can see the differences in here. Even though, a lot of us would argue to keep the county of Hamilton mostly whole, even with Warren in there and the new maps, Democrats still picked up a win. As far as the House, State House, I think, GOP overperformed in districts 5 and 10. That's southern Franklin County. Again, you see the winners, again, mostly incumbents. I got with a check there. Again, all these lean Democrat. And then, GOP might have flipped a seat up in District 5.
Hey, Trevor, it looks like David's mic might be working now.
All right, can you guys hear me?
We can.
Excellent. Hooray. I was listening, I just couldn't be heard, which, many of my students might have preferred that status if they could achieve it in real life.
Well, welcome, David. And, as I was just saying, GOP may have flipped a Democratic district and 5 with an incumbent, Richard Brown, which was previously, I think, District 20. So what do you have anything to add so far?
Well, certainly I would note one of the impressive things about the performance of the state legislative map is, of course, that it was built to produce a skewed outcome, and I think it probably overperformed even its creators' hopes and expectations, which, as a bottom line, is a pretty impressive feat. And one of the themes that we're going to walk away from 2022 is, if you skew a map, it doesn't really matter where the baseline is, and this is one of the successes as it would be viewed by the map's creators. If you skew a map, it doesn't matter whether you input 55% of the vote or 60% of the vote. You build in a skew so that you're rewarded at any level, and that's certainly one of the things we saw. And the numbers that you're pointing out, even in Franklin County, which obviously is a very Democratic county, you saw some Republican successes based on these as favorable a set of lines as they could have come up with for Franklin County.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And you'll see that reflected in the Senate map as well when we get to it. And I also wanted to remind everyone, these results aren't official. Those won't be out for a while, official results. And then that race in District 5, I don't believe has been called yet. It's just, there's just a few hundred votes separating Brown and Beach. But as far as things are looking, it may break towards Republicans. And then here's just a map of how things have changed. Again, District 5 this time around used to be District 20, Brown's district. And you see they moved that from more of an eastern down to more of the southern portion of the county. And then 10, which Republicans, that was a Republican seat held by Laura. Well, it used to be District 23, but you can see now pretty much, District 10 and 5 look to be, both of those were, you can see how they were gerrymandered on the bottom there. How they used to be more District 20, especially District 5, or District 20, which is now 5, used to skew a lot more Democratic, but and now that they passed it off as a Democratic leaning district, but that looks like it may go GOP.
Well, one of the things we should say is that everybody's going to get the slides. So if you want to do a deeper dive, Jen was mentioning that Laura Lanise, if you were wondering who you were thinking of, it was Laura Lanise. All right, and moving along, Trevor.
All right, and this is the other half of the competitive House races. Again, the GOP overperformed, I think, in 41 and 49. And then there's some, if you see the asterisks on the side there on 34, 49, and 59, those weren't included in the toss-ups that you'll see most folks in the 16 toss-ups. These are ones that I was following and put into the toss-up range. And the big surprise, I think, is 49 right here, which was an upset. And GOP flipped a district, District 49, House District 49. Which if you look at the list of the 16 toss-ups that everyone was passing around, that race wasn't on there. So that's a big a standout race, I believe. And then I thought something interesting also popped up to me, just 59. There was no Republican in that race, but there were 2 independents. Eric Ungaro, I think, he used to be a Democrat for a long time, but he broke away from the party not too long ago. But you see there was 2 independents, and the winner, Lauren McNally, doesn't have a majority. She just has a plurality. And then the 2 independents together have over 50, have 60%. So I just thought that was interesting as like a, Catherine and I were discussing ranked choice voting and other things the other day. And, maybe if we had ranked choice voting, it's possibly we could maybe had an independent pulling that off. I don't know. But here's that rate that 49, District 49 that GOP picked up. And you can see, I think, again, gerrymandering play, like it used to be, 49 used to be Canton, majority of Canton, and then swung around and grabbed Massillon. And now, it goes to the northwest and is out there in, like, I think it's like McDonaldsville up there. So again, you can see on the bottom how that chipped into the Democratic portion of voters, and GOP was able to pick that seat up. So I thought that was a big standout there. And then for the Senate, as I was telling Professor Niven there, you could see in Columbus and Franklin County, Southern Franklin County, again, went red. The GOP flipped the Senate seat in Southern Franklin, Tina Maharath. And so, again, that was a big upset. A lot of things to be said about that race as well. But if you see it here again, you see how that changed. District 3 used to hug the eastern portions of Franklin, and now it's grabs majority of the southern portion of Franklin, and those two districts you see right here, 10 and 5 are in that Senate district, and it went for the Republicans. So that's all I got. What else? Things you got to say, Professor Niven? Love to hear some more analysis you have there.
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be with everybody again. You know, this long journey, and we're not anywhere close to the end of it in terms of getting fair districts for Ohio. But we can say, and I, very much echo what Freda said earlier, that some things have been accomplished even in this round of the fight, and there is something good to be taken of it. We'll have a lot more election data available, a lot more capacity to do analysis about what these districts did in the future. But I want to give you one number that jumps out at me from this election that I think really gets at the heart of why all of you care about gerrymandering and why all of you fight for fair districts. That number is 269,000. 269,000. And what that represents is the number of Ohioans who showed up and voted, cast a ballot, and skipped their state house race. 269,000 Ohioans went to the trouble of voting and skipped over their state house race. And I am going to tell you, that is the power of gerrymandering. And you might say, all right, well, people can skip a race if they want to. There's no reason why it has to be gerrymandering. I did a little quick back of the envelope math in Michigan, where they have a commission drawn map where the maps, in those state house districts are much better at reflecting the actual people and their concerns in their communities. And the rate at which Michiganders skipped their state house races was less than half the rate of Ohio, less than half. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't like being beaten by Michigan in anything. And yet here we are looking at a system in which they literally, in all respects, have more respect for the voices of their voters. And those voters then, have more respect for the process and participate. So, one of the things we quite naturally want to look at is, okay, well, how many seats did the party win? How many seats did the party win, and how gerrymandering affects that? Some of the research that I'm getting into, that I'm working with graduate students on, really trying to understand not just that part of it, but also the human effect. Because ultimately, gerrymandering is people. It's ultimately an effect that is borne by the people. And I'm going to tell you, those 269,000 Ohioans are directly paying a price for what the Redistricting Commission decided to impose on them and on the entire state. So, as I said, it's a pleasure to be with you again tonight. And if there are any questions or whatnot, I'm certainly happy to talk more about these election results. But for me, the number is 269,000 that jumps out at me about this race.
Well, thank you so much for that. Thank you, Trevor, and thank you, Professor Niven. We appreciate that. We're now going to move on to a bigger stage and welcome Dan Vicuna from Common Cause National, who's going to talk about a national impact of gerrymandering. Dan.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me. I want to just talk a little bit about how redistricting impacted, the overall picture for Congress, U.S. House specifically, obviously. So partisan gerrymanders are obviously a huge issue around the country, particularly in places where the legislature is in charge. You saw some mixed results in terms of courts pushing back and policing those. In Maryland, New York, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania, state courts exercised real authority to get involved and order new maps. Pennsylvania, it was because there was a stalemate, Republican legislature, Democratic governor. You had a play in Kansas, a different story. The state court there decided to take the Rucho v. Common Cause route and decide that it wasn't going to play any role in partisan gerrymandering, gerrymanders, policing them. Florida is to be determined. We and some other of our friends sued on the grounds that the congressional map and also state legislative maps violate the state's constitutional prohibition against partisan gerrymandering. The state court let them be used for this cycle while the case is being litigated. So we'll see how that goes. In the next section, there were also some racial gerrymanders that were allowed to be used this cycle. Like Ohio, there were maps that were either determined to be illegal by trial courts or are the courts believe are likely to be determined illegal when they're adjudicated in a full trial. These are states Georgia, Louisiana, and Alabama, where the situation basically each of those states is that plaintiffs believe that the math is there to create an additional majority Black district, which the legislature did not do. For primarily partisan and discriminatory reasons, but those maps were allowed to be into effect. Were allowed to go into effect this cycle. So those cases in Georgia and Louisiana will be adjudicated at trial. Alabama went to the Supreme Court, and the conservative justices gave some tough questioning and have some troubling ideas about the scope of the Voting Rights Act as it applies to redistricting, but we don't know where it's going to go yet. We'll have a decision sometime between now and June of next year to see where the VRA goes. But it wasn't all bad news. At the congressional level, I think having a lot to do with organizing at the grassroots. You saw particularly communities of color getting a seat at the table. Just a few examples. In Minnesota, we and our allies with some organizations representing communities of color in the state and individual plaintiffs in Minnesota for the first time in the 60 years, that basically every cycle, every redistricting cycle, Minnesota's redistricting has gone to a court. We brought together communities of color, drew maps based on extensive feedback we got from those communities. And won some important wins, kept together a Mexican-American community that straddled a couple of St. Paul and a St. Paul suburb, kept together for the first time in the state's history, 3 different Native communities in the northern part of the state. So we won some important victories there. Independent commissions, of course, provided kind of the gold standard for what access to the public at large, transparency, fairness for communities of color really should look like. In Colorado, Colorado Common Cause really fought for the creation of at least a Latino influence district, and that did result in the first ever Latina ever being elected to Congress from Colorado, second Latino ever, but at the moment the state had none elected from the U.S. House. California, 6 new majority Latino districts, 2 new Black influence districts, some other wins for Asian Americans at the state legislative level, a couple of Asian American majority districts. In Michigan, I think you saw, this is not Congress, but in the state house, real close adherence to community feedback about what empowering the Black community, particularly in the Detroit area, would look like. And that map really, I think, produced some impressive results, likely going to result in the first ever Black Speaker of the House. But on a congressional level, sort of more on the partisan front, you saw Democrats win 7 of 13 seats. They won kind of a bare majority of the popular vote in the state. That's not how Michigan played out on the partisan level the last time around when the legislature was in charge. So some disappointments. Obviously partisan gerrymandering played a big role in states where legislature still plays a very significant role in the process or leads the process entirely. You did see some courts exercising their authority to do something about it. And in other places, we showed that reform really can make a big difference, both for communities of color and for partisan fairness. So that's the overview. Happy to take whatever questions the team thinks are useful to me to dig into. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dan. I mean, I think the $1 million question obviously is, I haven't checked my New York Times for the last 2 seconds, but I think the last time I checked it, the Republicans were at 217 and the Democrats were at 209, and there were 11 left to be decided, or whatever the numbers were. But when we finally get a final tally in the US House, and it looks like the Republicans will have the control of the House, can we confidently say that that is the result of using gerrymandered maps that had been struck down, or what role in terms of the final outcome of the makeup of the House, can we put some of that on gerrymandering in the end?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely plays a role. I mean, I think you saw, particularly, for example, in the 3 states that had that should have added a majority Black district. Those were just because of the way voting patterns go. Those almost certainly be additional Democratic districts. I think Republicans, obviously controlled more state legislatures and had the opportunity to gerrymander more congressional districts in their favor. So it certainly played a role in what the makeup of the House is going to look like.
Yeah.
Yes. So Dan,
USA Today. Sorry, just seeing Michael.
Yes, that in fact we got results.
Yeah.
One of the things that I saw in the chat that I thought was kind of interesting to think about, it has to do with more progressive areas choosing to do what they could to rein in gerrymandering, and other areas not reining it in at all, and kind of your thoughts about kind of those trends and how that'll impact the reform movement across the country.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been a correlation with states that have a ballot initiative option. I mean, I think Michigan is more, it's a mixed bag, right? It went to Donald Trump and is maybe more purplish, although it trended Democratic again this election. It's a state where voters, approved reform at the ballot. I think you saw sort of a somewhat troubling trend of Democratic judges at the state Supreme Court level being willing to push back against gerrymandering, no matter who's doing it, with Republican judges being more reluctant to police it against Republican legislators. So unfortunately, yeah, I mean, you see party playing a role, and some of these reforms achieving more success in some Democratic states. I think sometimes our opponents look to, say, California, in particular Republican opponents of reform, look to California and say, look how Democratic it became. I think it's kind of useful to remember that it's a state in which, by quite frankly being pretty Mexican hating, the Republican Party in California kind of killed itself, and this became a very heavily Democratic voting state. So it's really more about the political trends in the state than the independent commission. So yeah, I mean, we want to see this succeed in whatever state's willing to pass reform, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's also that, kind of feeling that, a lot of people, I know a lot of people on this call who got out there and they had their petition booklets, and they were happy to rein in their own power, as well as the power of an opposite political party, in order to make sure that things are fair. And this kind of feeling that, well, in states that kind of are trending Democratic, they have been willing to do independent commissions, or they have been willing to be kind of more reasonable. But then you have a state like Ohio where, no holds barred, the party in power had no qualms and no willingness to compromise. And so then you end up with this kind of lopsided thing where one side is kind of going for the jugular if it's going to get them another seat, and the other saying, well, let's be really fair here and make sure that everyone is represented. And, and of course we want fairness. We want everyone to be represented. But, it hurts sometimes.
That does seem to be the theme, right? So, that we will continue on and we'll keep going on. I noticed in the chat there was some reflection that Secretary Frank LaRose is considering making it more difficult to do citizen initiatives and engage in direct democracy. And this is a point where we're saying, well, wait a second, these folks are drunk on power. What do you do with drunks? You take away their car keys. And so we're talking about, hey, let's actually do a reform where we do an independent, insulated citizens commission. And what does the Secretary of State do? He talks about actually making it harder to do citizen initiatives. And so we'll see what happens tomorrow. I think the thing that's very clear, and that people shouldn't work, as we're going into this, that this would be a change to the Ohio Constitution. And so, these kind of attacks we've been able to push back because they're wildly unpopular. It's taking away the power from people. And we're not just, progressive people, not moderate people, all the people, including the conservatives. And when you think about many of those folks that worked on term limits. So as we go forward, we're going to be working on a plan, but just know we would be talking about a change to the Ohio Constitution. So it takes a lot more work than you expect. Jen, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, we are talking to our allies. I want to remind everyone that at Lame Duck 2018, Common Cause and League, along with many others, were able to defeat HJR 19 that was going to make it harder to get things on the, get petitions on the ballot. So we will come out swinging against any of that. Also, just a reminder that we do have voter legislation that could really change voting in Ohio. So I will let you all know that we do the League State House Day, which is usually in the spring, is actually on December 7th. And so would love to have all of you come down, and we will be talking about both of these issues, House Bill 294, the initiative process, gerrymandering, and so that we can really do our best to defend democracy during Lame Duck. Dan, I've been thinking a lot about how the bench in Ohio for Democrats is weak, and I think there could be a whole bunch of reasons for that. But I'm wondering about, from a national perspective, have you seen where one party just continually is not having opportunities to kind of build name recognition in maybe local races, maybe even like, city council is gerrymandered or the state house is gerrymandered, and not really having the opportunity to really kind of develop strong campaigns because there are just so many districts that are off limits to them? Do we see kind of other ways beyond the districts themselves that might actually weaken a party? Maybe it's harder to fundraise, things like that. I'm just wondering if you've thought at all about this, or there's been any conversation about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in places where districts are just out of reach, or a large number of districts are just out of reach for one party, you see a lot of races where state legislators in particular run unopposed. And, I think we've seen campaign cycles that might be bad for one party, and maybe there's a challenger who doesn't win or comes close, but it helps them build name recognition, a fundraising base. But I think if you have so many districts where you don't even have a person who bothers to run because there's absolutely zero chance of winning, I think that's certainly gonna thin out who gets the experience of running, who learns how to fundraise, who builds a fundraising base, and then who can have another legitimate shot the next time around. So I think it stands to reason that gerrymandering can have an impact, a kind of broader impact on kind of competition in the state.
Yeah. Well, we're coming towards the hour, so I think we'll move to the next slide. Just wanted to remind folks that, yes, the oral arguments for Moore v. Harper are on December 7th, and actually on another, and I love the, editorial cartoons. And this link, I think Tiffany will pop it in the chat. It's just really fascinating. It's a kind of annotated guide to all the different amici briefs. So, it's really interesting, all the different people who have spoken out against independent state legislature theory. And if you go to the next slide, you will see we have a link for, we're going to have a listening party, a listening event, maybe not party atmosphere, but on this December 7th at 10 a.m. So there's a short link there. And then I don't know if folks have had a chance to listen to this episode of This American Life. It's both wonderful to hear folks, but also painful to kind of run us through the tragedy that was redistricting in Ohio this year. So I can't recommend it to you without also acknowledging that it may hurt. But I wanted to ask Catherine and Jen and whoever else is on who participated in this to say what it was like to be interviewed by Ira Glass and, be on the show.
So why don't we start with Jen? One of the things I always wondered about was what Ira Glass was like and like how they put these things together. So Jen, what was it like to be interviewed by Ira Glass?
Well, I think it's interesting because the interview is one thing, but I think I probably spent at least 10 hours, I don't even know how many hours I spent talking to him and helping him just find resources and just so interesting in terms of all the different things he wanted, right? At the very last minute, we didn't even know, kind of like show business, which I come from show business. People may or may not know that, but you don't know if the show's going to go on, if everything's going to come together. And he was still looking for audio of when the bills passed, which finally I was able to connect him with Karen Kassler, where he could get some Republicans talking about the audio. But just a really inquisitive guy who really cared about all the details, more details. He forgot to confirm with me that I was going into the studio. And I was going to come in with my notes, like the timeline and all that stuff, but he forgot to confirm and called me, and the studio was already waiting for me. And so I went in there without my notes, and he was like, so Jen, how did it feel on September 12th at 9:30 when blah, blah, blah? And you're like, I don't remember what happened on September 12th. That stuff was really funny, but he was incredibly great, I thought, and caring. And sent actually a really warm email to me afterwards. I don't know if he did that to you, Catherine, but a very personal and warm email. And I will just say this, he is so good at making you just think you're just having a conversation. I'm not easily tricked by reporters, but he's really good at that. Catherine, please jump in.
So I had a funny story. So it was August, and I get this phone call from that voice, this Ira Glass voice. And I have a friend who does an Ira Glass impression. And I was like, yeah, sure. I was like, well, so how are things going? And I start, off, yes. And then he's like, no, this is Ira Glass. And I was like, for real? So, and I told him a story about how I have this friend named Cindy Canary, and she was interviewed. She lives in Chicago, and she was interviewed by Ira Glass maybe, 12 years ago. And I was on one of my, jaunts across the state of Ohio, and I almost drove off the road when I heard Cindy Canary's voice on the radio. So I'm telling him how excited I am, and I'm just gushing, of course, like, an idiot. But he continued to talk to me for a really long time. So that first time we just chatted about like what it was like and who he should talk to. And he was just, really, really lovely. I did the same kind of thing with Jen, where there were the in studio kind of interviews that would have added up to I don't know, 6 hours, 8 hours, just really long. So it made me just have a better appreciation of the kind of effort that goes into doing these things. Now, I did tell him that this happened. So, you know, my daughter listened to a lot of NPR growing up. Okay, so not surprising. She also loves a show called Veronica Mars. Now, Veronica Mars featured a cameo with Ira Glass, and Laura could not believe that Ira Glass had time to be in this movie. You know, she was just so shocked. So I'm telling Ira this, and Ira was like, Kristen Bell is a national treasure. Of course I would be in this movie. I also discovered that he is a Buffy fan. So one of the things that was nice is that it was very kind of the kind of conversation that it was, of course, about redistricting, but he managed to talk love of Spider-Man. And you may be surprised by this. He doesn't mind the fundraising times, you know, where you're all trying to raise money. He didn't mind that. So I thought that was interesting. Now, I know that Ann Henkener was also interviewed by him. Ann, are you still on? And do you want to say a few words? I'm checking to see if Ann is here.
Yes, she is here.
Yay, Ann. What was it like?
Yeah, my talks with him were kind of like a trip down memory lane, because we were doing the years 2005 to 2015, which is when I was more active in the redistricting thing. And his curiosity and his calmness, I think we're all coming to the kind of those same things, that he just did an amazing job. I was pretty terrified to talk to him, and but the terror could last only so long with his just talking with him. It was pretty amazing.
Hey, Dick,
That's
do you want to
wonderful.
tell us
Yeah,
what it was
Dick's
like?
there too.
Yes, it was really quite amazing. He interviewed me for 3 hours, and I was very impressed by his knowledge and rigor. I mean, he really knew every little aspect of the negotiating process that brought about the constitutional changes. And he did a wonderful job of penetrating right into what went wrong, and clearly identified Huffman as the evil genius behind all of this. And I only fear what we may be dealing with over the next couple of years, given these gerrymandered maps. We've already seen the first indication that taking power away from the state school board, because the state school board was controlled by Democrats, and that may be a model for what we're going to be looking at over the next couple of years. We clearly need to do something about this.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Now, David Niven, I know you were also interviewed. Do you have something you'd like to add?
I
think he might be gone.
well, he is there, but his audio wasn't that.
Yeah, he was struggling with his audio. I guess what I do want to highlight is just the sheer number of people that were interviewed. And
Yeah.
I love the part that was about, he got Maureen O'Connor to talk too.
Absolutely.
So if you haven't listened, it's well worth it. And it was a very good experience for all of us. So I was glad to have an opportunity just to give you a little peek behind the curtain.
Absolutely.
Was it really painful? I haven't been able to bring myself to listen.
No, I mean, honestly, I laughed through a lot of it. Which you wouldn't tell, because the first thing he quotes for me is I'm saying I cried. But I laughed through a lot of it. It was pretty okay.
Okay. I'll have a drink while I listen.
That's right.
There you go.
Okay, so just wrapping up here, guys, just to let you know, and again, we will send a link out a little bit before next Huddle meeting. We're going to be hearing from Anthony Eade, who was one of the commissioners in Michigan. And I know there's a lot of interest in what happened in Michigan. We'll send these slides so you can obviously read more about him. And that's about it. The next slide is just some links, and you know, you can go ahead and, oh, if you did miss last month's Huddle meeting, I highly highly recommend the recording of the conversation that Catherine had with Patricia Sine from the California Redistricting Commission. It was really fascinating about the whole process, about her, deciding to be on, applying, what it was like inside the meetings, how the whole thing worked. It was fascinating. So, hopefully that will be even more relevant next month when we're looking at Michigan. Thank you guys so much. We will send a follow-up. We appreciate you being here. And I really just want to acknowledge that I see all these questions in the chat. A vast proportion of them stick me in the heart with a dagger, because they are about, we need fairness and righteousness in this fight and how difficult it is to get that. And we would answer these questions if we could, we promise you, and we will try to move to something that brings, justice and fair redistricting to Ohio. But we acknowledge that it is incredibly difficult. But we see your questions and we want to answer them. And we will try to answer them, but many of them just don't have a decent answer, is the honest truth. So we will follow up, look for something from us tomorrow. We're in this fight together, and we appreciate each and every one of you, and have a good rest of your evening.
And stay warm and be safe with that first little snowfall.
Absolutely.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Well,